Welcome back. We last left off with me installing a debatably quick and definitely dirty quarry system for some easy stone and ore generation. Quarrying, in addition to not being very quick, is also kind of inefficient, so I won't be seeing dividends for that for quite some time, which leaves me with surprisingly little to do in the near future. I don't really want to establish myself permanently in a dimension just yet because I have plans for making my own down the line, but doing that property requires some legwork, so let's get started. There are two dimension-focused mods in this pack, Dimensional Doors and Mistcraft, which I will come back to later. Dimensional Doors is essentially an infinite dungeon crawler focused around exploring this liminal space between worlds that allows you to travel between dimensions using, you guessed it, doors. Most of the dungeon loot from it isn't terribly useful, and I have long since surpassed the point that any of the dungeon traps in there will be particularly dangerous, but there are a few things that I want to grab to make dimension hopping a bit easier for me in the future. For the most part, I prefer to avoid the dungeon crawling part of this mod because it is world-breakingly buggy when you spend too long inside of it, but for demonstration purposes a short trip should be fine. The first step in accessing the dungeon is to find a naturally generated dimensional gateway. These structures are little blobs of stone bricks with an unstable portal-looking thing in the middle, and entering that portal is a one-way trip to the start of a dungeon. Of course, finding one of the things is something of an exercise in frustration, but I do eventually track one down in the middle of a lake. The dimensional dungeon is best described as an endless sequence of stone brick structures floating, like visually at least, they're not actually floating, in an endless void. In reality, it's just a bunch of blocks built onto the floor of a flat 3 chunk by 3 chunk cube of perfectly black blocks that emit light at the same level as glowstone, but the aesthetic, at least, is really cool. My job is now to wander through the areas, grabbing whatever loot I'm interested in, looking for an exit. Iron doors lead to a different room of the dungeon, the wooden door I came in from leads back to the previous room, and any other wooden doors will let me escape to a random location in a random dimension. My goal here is mostly just to stock up on the fabric of reality, which is the block the dungeon is made out of. You can mine it with Silk Touch, and in the future that is probably what I will do just to save time, but I wanted to show off the dungeon a bit, so I'm going to be looting it the old-fashioned way. This stuff is used to craft a single-use item called a stabilized rift signature, and some other things that we don't care about. When you make a rift with this item and place dimensional doors on either side of them, they will link together, which allows you instantaneous dimension-crossing travel at the cost of a single right-click. To balance this massively overpowered feature, the dungeons are equipped with a number of nasty traps. Most of them are entirely invalidated by my ability to fly and tank everything short of a pocket nuke, but without power armor or an encyclopedic knowledge of what kind of traps there are, these dungeons are not terribly friendly places to wander around in. To make things even more fun, if you die in this dimension, you go to Limbo, an endless void of almost black everything that can only be escaped by finding puddles of stable reality to jump through that throw you out randomly into the overworld. Cool aesthetic, but very annoying to navigate around. Unfortunately, it looks like I'm going to be taking a trip down there because due to a bad set of traps and dungeon spawns, I am now soft-locked into a specific area of the dungeon. When you die in the dimensional dungeon, all of your items are returned to you when you enter Limbo, but the process is a little bit buggy when it comes to armor, and if you have a full inventory, it can delete it, which is why I no longer have a helm. This is annoying, but it's not really the end of the world because power armor is about as cheap as dirt by this point, but it does serve as an excellent warning that mods in this pack do not function correctly some of the time, even without intentional jank involved. I keep regular world backups for this reason, and stuff like this is exactly why. Little bit of puddle jumping in Limbo later, and I'm spit back out into the overworld only about 1,000 blocks south of my base. I've had spawns tens of thousands of blocks away before, so this is really quite generous as dimensional doors go, and after a little bit of glute warming, I end up back home. Meanwhile, back in our universe, the quarry is still glopping away, so let's go ahead and explore Mistcraft for a bit. Mistcraft is a mod that lets you make custom dimensions. The general game loop is you take a bit of leather, slam in some property pages in a very specific and not at all unintuitive and arbitrary order that I don't have to look up every time I do it, and out comes a book that describes the exact parameters of the dimension that you want created. At least that's the idea. In order to keep this from being completely unbalanced, Mystcraft implements a stability mechanic. That means worlds that are naturally more unstable, read, are made entirely out of diamond blocks surrounded by seas of UU matter, have a nasty habit of setting you on fire, inflicting negative potion effects, dropping explosive meteors on you, or in string cases just spontaneously rotting away to nothing. All of this is a moot point now, though, because I don't have any of the property pages, and I don't really feel like trading with villagers for them just yet, which means I instead get to create random worlds with blank paper and roll the dice. The usual way that I go about doing this is to make a world and enter it. When I enter this mystery world, I immediately slam down a bookstand with a linking book to take me back home, because without one of those, you are almost permanently trapped in the Mystcraft dimensions. And then I will take notes on general features that I see, good or bad. After my homework is done, I then explore a bit, grab the pages from the library that's in the dimension, which isn't usually difficult because the libraries spawn in the same spot every time, and then I return back to my landing point to skedaddle on back home. I also make a point of carrying no less than 4 spare linking books to the overworld in my Galacticraft Oxygen gear slots. These slots can carry any item in this version of the game, because coding, and because they are modded slots, they are generally resistant to most inventory modification jank like auto-sorting and falling into limbo. Am I paranoid? You might say that, yes. My first dimension is an excellent example of this. It rolled into a mostly hospitable Endless Plains biome, but for some reason, and probably it's the Eternal Day cycle, it's unstable, which manifests as a persistent weakness potion effect and lightning striking all over the place. This is quite common for random dimensions, since without any specifications as to what should or should not be present, the game flips out and does whatever, which usually means something goes wrong. The library structure is easily located, and I net myself a few new pages before bailing. Dimension 2, basically the same, but this time it's an endless desert with slowness. The library also seems to have had a run-in with unfortunate plumbing problems, and decided to generate on a giant pool of poop water. It's a good thing those property pages are laminated, eh? Yeah. Dimension 3 finally starts shaking things up and gives me a checkerboard of one chunk-wide swamp and ocean biomes. It also makes me extremely hangry, despite not visually having anything that should have destabilized it in the first place, but it's Mystcraft, so such is life. Dimension 4 really starts showing off and gives me a floating island world of forest and ice mountains with no sun, no daylight cycle, as far as I can tell whatsoever, and everything is brown. It's not pretty, per se, but it is certainly different. Things continue like this for some time. I get some interesting dimensions, a whole bunch of utterly inhospitable dimensions, and most importantly, amass a sizable collection of property pages that can be copied and eventually used to build my own worlds. If you're paying attention to the screenshots, there are actually a bunch of other world types that you can get with this mod, but for some reason all of mine seemed to want to turn into end island generations, so whatever, you do you, game. 16 random worlds in, and nothing particularly interesting has shown up. This isn't really a surprise, though, because when Mystcraft rolls for random traits, it usually likes to select traits that are close-ish to the overworld template that it's used to, but as a result of all of the library rating, I do now have enough pages to try making better worlds. The two that I select here for demonstration purposes are Cave World and Crystal Formations. On their own, these are basically the Mystcraft equivalent of cavemen grunting, but hopefully they're specific enough on their own to get me some worlds that are a little bit more novel to look at. It turns out that my hopes are in vain. Not a single world generates with either of the two traits I requested, though I did at least get some worlds with actual land in them for once. I could keep grinding out worlds to try and get more pages, but it's probably best to just make a set from villager trading before I experiment with Mystcraft too much. The worlds are just too picky in this version to get much use out of with improperly formatted sentence structure. Back at home, my quarry has finally finished its first excavation bill. I really don't need any more cobblestone at this point, and in fact would actively like to not have any more, but more ore won't ever go amiss, so I go ahead and mark out another area for it to start chewing away on. I don't really have plans for what I want to do with the stuff I get from my quarries, but if I'm going to be stuck in plain old boring normal land for a while, I might as well keep assimilating parts of it into my own personal storage banks. Speaking of assimilating parts of the world, I also should probably go pay the End a visit. This is pre 1.8, so there aren't end cities or anything to loot, but I will need to pay a visit there at some point to get the egg and the bees, and there are a couple of projects that I need endstone for in the near future. This also will have the side benefit of justifying the entire reason that I went into the Dimensional Doors dungeon in the first place, which thus far I've done absolutely nothing with. Field trip time! Or... maybe not field trip time. I may or may not have accidentally parked my temporary encampment right on top of the stronghold. Oh well. And just like that, I am the proud owner of Egg. And also all of the end hives, and some endstone. In order to buy Mistcraft property pages from villagers, I will need two things. Villagers and emeralds. Emeralds are going to be an issue that I will come back to later, but the villager part at least is doable. In this version of Mine Factory Reloaded, there is a machine called an auto-spawner. When given a sample mob and a Pokeball, I mean a reusable safari net, power, and experience juice, it does exactly what the name suggests and spawns a copy of the mob provided. I can easily abduct a nearby villager and have infinite power, so the real issue is the XP juice, which is a fluid that can only be generated by sucking away your XP levels with the world's single most scariest syringe, or by slaughtering large amounts of mobs with a mob grinder, which is a second kind of machine from the same mod. The mob grinder needs power, so no issues there, but it isn't terribly efficient at making mob juice, so I'm going to somehow need to reliably make a huge number of mobs without any personal involvement from my avatar. This is why I needed the endstone. This mod pack has Soul Shards, a mod that allows you to create very strong custom mob spawners out of most non-boss mobs in the game. To get one of these shards, you place a block of glowstone on the ground, surround it laterally on all four sides with netherrack, surround the netherrack laterally on all sides with endstone, and then right-click on the glowstone with a diamond. This creates an unattuned soul shard in what has to be the most unintuitive and difficult to explain crafting process in the entire pack. In order to attune and level up this soul shard, you have to kill a mob that you want to attune the shard to with the shard in your hotbar. Once attuned, any mob kills that apply to that shard will be added to its total, up to 1024. The number of mobs you kill and the strength of your shard determines the strength and traits of the spawner that you can make out of it, but for our purposes we want at least one max level shard. In newer versions of the mod, you had enchantments to help with this process and could absorb spawners of the same type as the mob the shard was attuned to speed it up even further, but none of those quality of life changes exist yet, making a max level shard something of an exercise in grinding. If only I had access to a really stupidly overpowered and cheap to assemble way of spawning a huge number of the exact same kind of mob. Now that I have the soul shard maxed out, the rest is easy. Grinders consume basically nothing for power, and I don't care about mob drops at all right now, so my incredibly high-tech mob farm is a pit with some conveyor belts, a soul cage, and a bit of pipe to pump the juice where it needs to go. Everything is powered with standalone bioreactors that I will fill up by hand when I need to, but the goal here is mostly a proof of concept. Neither of these machines consume terribly massive amounts of power. Well, the concept has been proven. Excessively. It's almost like this was an intended game mechanic and everything is working exactly as designed, but no, that's silly. I would never exploit those. One of the perks of a Tier 5 Soul Shard is that it ignores spawning conditions. Mostly. We'll touch back on that. Which means that it will work even when the spawner it's in is lit. Endermen are troglodytes though, so I have to cover the mob grinding area anyway, otherwise the world will be covered with thousands of suspiciously similar looking 3.0 ape index having juice bags, and they tend to get grumpy if you look at them wrong. I have villagers now, but this brings up my second problem. I might have villagers, but I have nothing to trade with them. Emeralds are relatively new in this version of Minecraft, so a lot of content doesn't really do anything with them yet, and my options of production are all pretty terrible. I could breed bees, but emerald or olivine bees are in-game tier species and are terrible to boot. I could try and grow them with magical crops, but it takes 8 fully matured crops to make a single emerald, which is a phenomenally terrible exchange rate, and that's really it. Even Minecamp failed me here, because emeralds decompose into a bunch of stuff that is practically impossible to source, and emerald ore respects the same 2-to-1 exchange rate as all the other mods do, for once, so I can't even dupe them with a processing line. The only options I know of that are left are atomic assembly, which is a terrible way to do anything, even by my loose standards, trading, blech, manual labor, Fortune 3 looping to exploit the net 0.3 emeralds gained from breaking ore and recycling emeralds into more of it, blech, manual labor, or mining lasers, which are massively energy intensive and also kind of a pain in the butt to set up, so blech, manual labor again. I'll keep cracking at it, maybe something will come to me later. In the meantime, the 100 or so emeralds I netted from quarrying are enough to buy a couple of the pages that I'll need for making my custom world, so that part of the project was a success at least. But I do still have a few critical modifiers that I want before I really start trying to do Mistcraft. Mind you, that doesn't mean I can't have some fun with making worlds with the property pages I do have. Mistcraft book writing follows a pretty simple syntax wherein an optional set of modifier pages can make changes to a specified property of the world, of which there are many. Case in point, with this world I requested a flat world made entirely out of netherrack, a single biomed world, which should be an end biome, but I accidentally used the wrong page for this, so this is actually just gibberish, and I also gave it rainbows, because I like rainbows. The end result is a world string that reads netherrack flat end single biome rainbows, which is at least a little bit more literate than my first attempt, which were basically just infant babbling. I'm not certain if it's a fundamental misunderstanding of how the mod works, or if this is just such an old version that the quirks I know about from the newer ones don't apply, but I've always had trouble getting exactly what I want when I do this in BigDig. Case in point, of all the things that I asked for, the only thing I actually got was rainbows. I will ignore the world not being flat, because I ended up messing up the syntax for that, but the netherrack and single biome parts should have been formatted perfectly fine, and this very clearly does not have netherrack or a single biome in it. I did a little bit more research and confirmed that I did in fact go wrong when I used the end word. Mistcraft normally appends the word biome to the name string of a property page if it modifies a biome, and after some digging through the configs, I actually expect the end word as a modifier for the skybox, though I am not certain about that. What I actually should have written is limbo biome, single biome, and given that the limbo biome is an actual thing in this mod pack but is referred to as a pocket dimension biome, the name was a little bit confusing, but sure, whatever. I'm also reasonably certain that the material of a flat world with an end biome should be forced to be end stone regardless, so I also decide to forego the netherrack modifier and instead experiment with the end modifier for a bit. This produces another world that is nothing like what I asked for, and instead gives me a random cave world with multiple biomes that I very definitely did not specify. Thanks, Mistcraft. Cool. So, maybe the grammar rules are a little bit different. This is Mistcraft v.10, and the thing is ancient. So I did some more digging, and I suspect my problem is not so much my poor grammar, so much as it is the lack of grammar in the first place. My next set of experiments seem to confirm this, because I ended up getting some really cool combinations. I also learned that biome and world type controllers, the single two most important parts of the world, yeah, they are really sensitive to bad grammar, and even when I use exactingly specific grammar everywhere else to eliminate randomness, they sometimes still wig out and give me something weird. I'm not sure what the deal is with that. It's not even that it's unpredictable in how it extrapolates the structure, it just straight up does not seem to make a difference sometimes. So, I know some of you folks are familiar with digging around in ancient GitHub repositories for stuff on these mods, so if anyone knows where the source code for this version of Mistcraft has gotten buried, I would love to have a link so I can read through and figure out what I'm missing here. For my purposes, though, it doesn't really matter just yet, because you know what the solution to randomness is? Doing the same thing a whole bunch of times until the results change into something you want. Oh wait, no, that's insanity, my bad. I need more worlds for page collecting reasons anyway, so I decided to start industrially cranking out world candidates for me to live in. The results are almost everything I want, honestly. All four of them come out nearly perfect, except for the no Skylands part, because I don't have that mod. I'm not certain why they're getting instability, but we will ignore that. In the end, all of my work with villagers didn't make a whit of difference, though, because the test worlds were enough to get me the rest of the pages I needed, and my first complete age that I write comes out exactly as specified. Amazing that when you follow the instructions, good things happen, huh? Who'd have thought? As per request, it has an absolutely ridiculous amount of pretty colored stars. No sun, no moon, no weather, no daylight cycle, none of that useless, obnoxious stuff. The whole world is an entire jungle biome because I can't directly control foliage color in this version of the mod, and I wanted it to look nice with plants, but I also still wanted mobs to spawn. And there was supposed to be floating sky islands of land everywhere, but it looks like the world generation just straight up broke because all I can find is the little blobs that you see near my spawn point. But hey, I don't care, it's my world, it's cool, and I can make the islands myself later on if I really feel like it. Now that I have a place that I want to permanently set up shop in, it's time to start doing some building of my infrastructure in a completely different area, because I need to make more things, and sort of have been neglecting to do that until now. Yay, responsible time management. Anyway, once I have the stuff that I need, it's actually time to start working with the most broken mod in the pack, Modular Force Field Systems, or MFIS for short. That's right, Minechem. Your crown got stolen, and I don't think you have a hope of getting it back. MFIS does a lot. Like, way more than it has any reasonable right to, honestly, considering that the premise is basically turn energy into blocks. The part that I care about right now, though, is that it projects force fields, which are blocks, and you can change the shape of the blocks that it projects using mode change upgrades, which means that I can use this mod as the world's most expensive, most energy-hungry building guide in existence. Force field systems revolve around three blocks: a coercion driver, a fortron capacitor, and a force field projection unit. The driver accepts jaw-dropping amounts of energy to convert into a unit called fortron, which is for some reason expressed in joules, despite the fact that it is entirely different from the mechanism unit that goes by the exact same name, and expresses a unit of energy that is, in fact, created from joules. Sure. Fortron is then wirelessly transmitted to the Fortron capacitor, wow, creative naming, which balances the energy load of everything connected to it within a certain range. This may sound cool, but the reality is that the load balancing mechanic sucks absolute donkey and makes even the simplest systems require way more power to run than they ever should in the first place, so we generally don't use those. The force field block accepts Fortron power, and dependent on the upgrades installed, uses it to do fantastic things. But because it's a force field generator, that usually involves projecting a very large quantity of unbreakable force field blocks in the shape specified by its mode designator and in the size designated by its upgrades. Okay, great, fantastic. Only problem is the thing consumes a jaw-dropping amount of Fortron that scales with the number of upgrades and complexity of the operation you are having it perform, which means you need a square jaw-dropping amount of power generation plus extra if you play the mod as intended, especially if you want to overcome the inherent stupidity that is its load balancing mechanics. Or, if you prefer to actually play the game, you can skip all of that annoying fiddly stuff and just cheat. For reasons entirely beyond mere mortal understanding, Fortron is classified by the game as both a type of energy and a type of forge-compatible fluid, and all three blocks from MFIS are valid donors and receivers of it. In fact, not only is it a fluid, it's such an energy-dense fluid, and the Fortron capacitor is so incredibly bad at load balancing that it's often easier to just ignore using capacitors entirely, generate your Fortron on an entirely separate frequency, and then manually pump the stuff into a force field generator with pipes. Of course, this process is not without risks. The most efficient method of fluid extraction in the game is fluid ducts, which have somewhere in the rough neighborhood of a 2% chance of randomly corrupting your world every time you try and place one. Because MCEdit doesn't know how to interact with miscraft worlds, this also means that I have to revert my save every time this happens instead of patching it manually, which is often. Say it with me, folks. Back up your worlds. You can also use ender tanks, and I do that as much as possible because they can insert fluids by twiddling the knob on the front of them, and that lets you use less fluid ducts, but for certain applications, fluid ducts are simply better. The end result is appallingly ugly, but it gets the job done. The only real goal here for now was to make the thing that lets me not draw my own circles, because while I can eyeball them or I can use external tools for it, why should I do that when I could instead foreshadow harder than a solar eclipse on Neptune's North Pole? Now, for a little bit of building. Yep, there we go, good enough. No, of course it isn't finished, I just wanted to get an idea of how my plan would look before I actually started building it. I'm not gonna, do work for this, we have technology for that. And that technology? Worldedit. Yep, BigDig survival mode has Worldedit built into it. I don't know why, you don't know why, I don't think anybody knows why. It's just there as an option if you feel like using it. All funnies aside, if you know what you're doing and have literally infinite amounts of power, Emphas has some really strong upgrades that do a lot of things that normally would be reserved for server admins. Meet the Field Stabilizer and Disintegration modules. The Field Stabilizer module tells the force field generator to build with blocks that you've left in a chest next to the generator instead of creating force field blocks wherever the pattern says it should. The Disintegration module does the opposite and tells the force field to break any blocks. Both of them respect all of the shape and size modification upgrades. These modules, combined with the existing force field configurability, allow me to project and mask any shape that I can create with a force field by building and destroying blocks on different configuration settings. If you want a solid sphere 3 blocks wide, well, that's just a sphere of size 1 projected into a sphere of size 2, which is then projected into a sphere of size 3, with all 3 offset from the field generator by 3 blocks. If you instead, say, want a cube with a sphere carved into it, you can make a solid cube, like before, and then project a sphere of disintegration into it after the cube has been built. The only real downside is that the disintegration module doesn't return the blocks that it breaks directly, and you have to pick them up, but, I mean, come on, do you really think it matters in this mod pack? Funny bit of anecdotal story time. This mod also bypasses literally every anti-grief plugin that was on the market at the time this pack was actively played on public servers. I know this because I was an admin on one, and a significant portion of my responsibilities was trying to figure out how to keep people from not emphasizing red mattering, nuking, quarrying, bee-bombing, or otherwise ruining other people's stuff. We actually had to vet people who wanted to use Emphas as part of their tech, because it was so unfathomably destructive. Anyway, survival mode Worldedit is great, but the one serious drawback is how expensive the whole process is. I'm broke, not that you'd know it from looking at my ME system, and you need a ton of upgrades to get the block placement or breakage rates up to a point where it actually becomes useful, and unlike Worldedit, you also have to make the blocks you want to place. My selected building material was going to be paved whitestone, which is a cheap block that I can make out of cobblestone and sugar, or in processing terms, garbage and dupe glitches, but that plan went completely out the window, because it turns out Emphas does not respect block metadata when it places things. And this meant that instead of placing nicely paved whitestone, it converted all of my very nice whitestone into smooth blackstone, which is the exact opposite of the look I was going for. My solution to this is to switch over to smooth marble. Emphas won't overwrite its metadata because the metadata of smooth marble is 0, and I was considering using it anyway, but didn't because it was easier to use the other stuff, so other than it taking forever to smelt, there isn't really any harm done. Alright, so I have a platform. How do I deal with the constant zerg of mobs that unanimously decided they wanted to recreate the Occupy Wall Street movement in the middle of my factory floor? And also stab me. Well, I'm not really a fan of being stabbed, and I really don't feel like getting into the legal problems that comes with squatters' rights or political protests, so let's maybe do something about that. No, not light the place up to keep them from spawning. That's lame. What do you think this is, baby's first Minecraft? And also, no, not create a peaceful switch in this dimension because that involves doing actual work. Instead, let's continue down the path of using a pointlessly overpowered machine to fix it. Meet the interdiction matrix. If the force field generator was Worldedit, this thing is WorldGuard, and like the force field generator, it is part of Emphas. The interdiction matrix is mostly designed to be used to disallow player interaction or access to an area unless they're given permissions by the matrix itself, but one of the side benefits to its design is that it also has some ability to selectively kill all passive or hostile mobs, or, more relevant to me, disable their spawning in an area entirely. I will eventually want a proper peaceful switch just because the matrix is a little bit too anti-spawn happy sometimes, but it will do temporarily to keep the creeps off my back while I'm getting set up. As with everything Emphas, it has not a single subatomic particle's worth of chill when it comes to its energy demand, to the point that interdicting even a quarter of my base would consume more than 5 times as much power as the entire force field system ever did when it was running on full capacity. I've largely gotten away with using so little power at this point because there's a bug with how coercion drivers interact with universal cable that effectively boosts my efficiency by 800%, but that isn't even the problem anymore. The problem is I physically can't pump enough forcesium in fast enough to keep the thing running. I do have a design that gets around this, and it looks heckin' cool in the process, but I have nowhere near enough infrastructure to satisfy the material demand for it, so proper construction work and spawn proofing will have to wait until the next episode. Thank you for your time. The usual YouTube support options are below in the usual YouTube support locations if you are interested, and I hope you enjoyed.